Hi everyone, welcome to my first demo for 2023. In this demo, I'd like to explore the idea of having pieces that are somewhat interactive. I've had this idea before with some blocks that you could mix up and change their orientation and play with it to have a different look for every day or every month or whenever you want to change it. In this case, I wanted to be able to insert a piece within a piece. The idea is if I'm making round artwork and I keep the hole in the center the same size, then every smaller piece that I make to insert into the bigger piece will be interchangeable with every other piece I've made with the same hole size. In this demo, you'll see me make three large textured pieces, and two small textured pieces that fit into the larger pieces. I wanted to make three of each, but I've just run out of time, so I'm putting this together. So this demo is somewhat of a proof of concept. I've never made this before. It was just an idea that I had. Previously, I had laid pieces on top of other pieces, but never had them standing up. I wasn't sure how to attach them or keep them together or be able to mix them up with other pieces. But in this demo, you'll see that I've created a few larger pieces and then a few smaller pieces. The smaller pieces have spindles on the back, which fit into the whole of the larger pieces. Anyway, you get the idea. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll answer them as best as I can. Enjoy the show and let me know what you think. So for the start of this video, I'm just going to show you my process from how I start from a blank piece of timber or a rough cut piece of timber to cutting it out and putting it on the lathe to turn. The bandsaw is a pretty easy option for cutting things out, but if you haven't got a bandsaw, you can just use a chainsaw or a handsaw just to cut off those corners. Here you can see me opening up the chuck to its maximum width so I can measure it. The reason I'm doing this is because I want to make the tenon as big as possible, because as you'll see later in the end of this part of the video, I'm going to drill a hole all the way through to the other side. I always like doing this face cleanup work. It's kind of satisfying. For all of this demo, I'll be making a few pieces and they'll all be made from jacaranda timber. I find my timber from fallen trees, or sometimes people cut them down in their backyard and I find them listed online. Usually they're still whole trees and I get to cut them up to whatever size I need. Generally these days, doing more sort of sculptural and thinner pieces, I cut them to about 2 or 3 inches thick, and therefore they dry a bit quicker in my sort of outdoor kiln shed. That's just the way I do it now. I don't turn too many bowls, so this is a bit easier, unless of course I want to turn a bowl and I can't find a thick enough piece. I'm just doing a rough cut on this edge for the moment. I'll clean it up when I turn it around. Here I'm using my trusty Skilton sander that I've had for years and years. It may have a new head on it though, I don't think it's the original head. Well worth the money though. So this is my preferred bowl gouge. It's just a 1/2 inch P&N, I think, with a custom handle. I pretty much use this bowl gouge for everything. I might have a couple more, but I use them rarely. I actually still use some of the tools I got when I first got a lathe. I think they're Toolex, something like that. Not great steel, but they do the job. Still do the job. If anyone would like to know, I actually use ceramic coated sandpaper. So this edge I'm actually going to hollow out a bit so it's sort of concave, so it's higher on the outside. That way when you stand it up, it stands on the two edges and doesn't fall over the two outside edges it'll stand on. Here you can see the gap underneath the middle of the level, and it's actually sitting on the two outside edges. That's how I gauge that it's done correctly and that it actually will sit level. Now to drilling a hole through the middle. I'm just using a regular Forstner bit. Well, when I mean regular, I mean a good quality Forstner bit. I've bought a few poor quality Forstner bits in my time, and eventually I end up coughing up the money and buying a good set of Carbitool bits, which are a million times better. As you can see, it fell out of this cheap chuck. I recommend getting a much better chuck, like a keyless chuck, that I actually have on my drill press. Works a lot better and is a lot easier to use. Now I've finished that, I'm going to take it off the lathe for texturing, and I'm going to use my Woodcut Pro mount. I received this recently, and it's really good, and makes life a lot easier when texturing. Previously I'd just been doing it on the workbench or on a box on the workbench, and this is just a lot easier. This first texture I'm going to do with a floppy disk, just an ordinary cheap $5 floppy disk. When I say ordinary, I mean I did modify it slightly so that it's sort of angled to a point. So I just just used a piece of concrete just to give it the angle, so it gave a sharper edge. You can use any grit you like with the floppy disks. It doesn't really matter, and they last a long time. They're kind of not completely solid, so they are flexible, which actually gives a kind of a nice smooth finish. They do burn a bit though, but that's okay for my use because I tend to stain or paint things most of the time anyway. With this close up you can see a little bit of the burning, but it's not a great amount. If you had a coarser disc, then it wouldn't burn as much as a finer disc. I generally use a medium disc, maybe around about an 80 grit or 100 grit, something like that. As I say, if you go too fine, it just burns a lot, and it just wears out, I suppose, a bit faster, or gets clogged easier as well. Despite the actual size of the grinder and the disc, you can actually do quite delicate movements and quite delicate carving with it. I've done a lot of carving using the flap disc, and I highly recommend it. Practice makes perfect, of course. Make sure you practice as much as you can and do some practice just before you do your main piece. I practiced before I started this, just 'cause I haven't done it for possibly a couple of months. Everyone always asks me what type of grinder I use. I actually use the Blue Grinder. It works very well, and you do get what you pay for. Again, I did see a video on YouTube once where a guy pulled apart some grinders and found that the Makita was better built than a lot of the others. This whole texturing process for this piece probably took me about 20 minutes, something like that. I would have done some touch-ups after this short clip's finished as well. I'll have a good look over it and make sure everything's okay, and add some bits and pieces every now and then just to fill the vacant spaces. It's sort of best, I think, to not leave a lot of space between the texturing. Keep it as tight as possible, which you'll see in some of the carbide burr texturing I'll do further along in this video. You can see me here just filling some of the little spaces that I missed, or just giving a bit more character to the texture. There's no rhyme or reason in the way I do it, I just do it as I go along. Try not to think about it too much. I actually think I have about 7 or 8 grinders, different brands and models. I use all of them. Some of them have dedicated discs attached to them, like the Sabur discs. I just leave them on there constantly. Generally though, the ones that I leave on all the time are on a sort of a medium quality grinder. I don't buy any of the really cheap grinders anymore. You can buy $30 grinders or something around that in Australia, but they tend to not last very long anyway. So I don't recommend cheap grinders at all. I actually skipped the filming of the painting process for this piece. I did start to film it, and because I'm using like a spray paint, well, it's actually an acrylic spray paint, it just went everywhere, all over the camera. So I quickly stopped spraying and just did it off camera. I actually used Liquitex acrylic spray for this piece. Titanium white is the color, I believe. I think it's about $17 or $20 per can. But they do last for a few pieces, so it works out to be about $5 per piece. So here I'm using a skew chisel to create a bit of a bevel on the inside of the hole. Just working it backwards and forwards very lightly to create a nice smooth finish that should need a lot of sanding. I usually start at 120 grit, then 180, then 240, then 400, 800, 1600. They're the main grits I use for pretty much everything, although this one I just put a little bit of 240 and 400 just to finish it off, and 400 on the inside of the hole there. Now that it's off the lathe, I'm using my good old trusty flap disc to remove as much of the tenon as I can, being careful not to take off too much. Then I'll just use a regular orbital sander, in this case it's my Metabo that I've had for a long time, just to make sure it's all sort of flat and smooth and blends into the rest of the piece which I previously sanded on the lathe. Then once I've done this, I blow off as much dust as I can, and then I give it a light coat of artist spray, usually a matte artist spray. This sort of gives it a bit of protection so it doesn't get dirty and things like that. And of course here is the final completed piece. To finish this section off, I thought I'd show you a few textures you can create with the floppy disk. Sometimes I just spend a bit of time in the garage on the weekends or the evenings and just pick a tool and just create textures. Lots of experimentation leads to good ideas and practice. As mentioned earlier, the flap disc can create nice, smooth, curved textures. It can be a little bit hard to control, and you will kind of mess it up a little bit, but it's not really messing it up, it's just adding a bit of character, and textures don't always have to be perfect. So these are just a few ideas I had after creating the last piece. I had a spare 10 minutes or so, I thought I'd put together a few ideas. None of these I think are terribly outstanding, but they may lead to another idea in the future. The flap disc lends itself well to line designs, as you can see what I'm doing here. The one in the middle there didn't quite work out, looks a bit messy. As mentioned, it can be quite a delicate tool to use, and as you can see, using the flap disc and the grinder I can stay between the lines pretty good. You don't always have to create lines here, you can sort of carve into the wood, sort of like a bird disc I suppose, and create different textures. In a minute I'll turn this sort of sideways so you can see what it actually looks like when you have the light coming across in the correct or a certain way. In this section of the video, I'll show you how I create the piece that inserts into the bigger piece. It's not terribly hard to do, you just have to creep up on the actual spindle size that fits into the hole, otherwise it may be too loose or too tight. I'm using a thicker piece of timber for this as I want to make it a one-piece piece. The other version is you could do a normal sized piece and then glue on the spindle on the back so it can be inserted into the larger piece of art. As I mentioned, slowly creep up on the size of the spindle you need to have, and I use measuring calipers to make sure I get as close as I can. In this case I was looking for about 40 millimeters of spindle length. This would actually protrude from the back of the piece slightly, but I'll give the back of the spindle a slight bevel so it sort of looks right. If it's slightly longer, it means it might suit other pieces I make in the future. Here you can see I've moved on to a spindle gouge. This is what I'll use to fine tune the size of the spindle. Pretty much all of these pieces will have a concave front and a concave back. This is sort of something I've been doing for a while now, but in this case it actually allows the piece to be flatter, I suppose. These center pieces are determined to be about 10 millimeters thick. Any sort of thicker than that, they didn't kind of look right, and any thinner than that, they're just a bit thin and they could warp over time. So 10 mil is what I chose for this. Here I am making the concave front. The depth of this compared to the outside is about 5 millimeters thinner in the middle. Other pieces range from about 10 to 20 mil thinner in the middle. It's important to get the sanding perfect without any flaws. If there's any flaws, you'll see them between the textures if you don't get the textures tight enough. So I've actually created 3 lines this time. This way I can see how far I'm creeping in, or in this case creeping out with the hole in the bevel. It's also there for the textures, so I can go over the first line but not the second line. The first tool I'm using here is a brown carbide burr. As you can see, I've got a little picture of it there. These are the first texturing tools I ever used. I think I bought some off eBay for pretty cheap, and they've lasted quite a long time. They are designed to be grinding metal with, so wood is no problem for them. You do sort of again get what you pay for. Don't get the most cheapest ones or the most expensive. Somewhere in the middle will give you a decent quality bit. I find that when I'm making texture, it works best to have each texture overlap the other texture, so there's actual no space in between them. You might see me go over the same area again and just hit little spots that I might have missed where there is a bit of a gap, but generally I try and keep it as tight as possible. Also with this one I'm starting with a small burr, and then I'll increase the size as we go towards the outside edges. I've just moved to my die grinder just then with a bigger burr. As you can see, it's not burning as much as the little one, and the depth is controlled by how much I press it into the wood. This whole piece probably took me about half an hour, 40 minutes or something like that to complete. You do need lots of rest when using the die grinder because it's kind of heavy. The small rotary tools with the smaller burrs are the best to get started. It's cheap and the little rotary tools are cheap and you get just as good results. But you are limited to smaller pieces unless you want to make really fine textures on larger pieces, of course. With the outside, with this texture, I try not to get near the edges. If you go near the edges, it sort of ruins the outside line and it gives a bit of a funny look. Once again, I didn't film the painting of this one. I used this acrylic spray can and I didn't want to ruin my equipment, so I just didn't record it. But you get the idea, paint in a can. I do use a fair bit of acrylic paint and a lot of people ask me what brands to use or what type of paints I use. A lot of them think I'm using like milk paint or chalk paint, but I've tried those and they don't work as well. They tend to sit in the holes and clog them up, whereas acrylic paint's kind of a little bit stretchy or sticky, so you can pull out of the holes so it doesn't fill them up and make it look all mushy. So you can try them all. You might prefer the other ones, but I prefer acrylic paint. No particular brands. I just get whatever's available, but I don't get anything too cheap. Generally, a more expensive white paint will be better than a cheaper white paint just for the amount of pigment that's actually in it. So I'm just using the skew chisel again to create that inside bevel and using the very corner of the skew chisel to create some lines. And that's the piece complete. This time I'm going to make a piece that has rings, and within each ring is going to be a different texture. Once I've done the texturing and the painting, I'm going to sand back some of the rim and middle center sections to reveal the wood behind it to give a bit of contrast to the paints that I've used. I did use a pencil to accurately measure this out, which I don't normally do. I don't normally measure anything. But as you can see, I had to make a small change anyway. My measurements didn't quite work, or I didn't quite think it looked right. I usually judge everything by eye. As I say, I don't measure anything usually. I'm using my round nose scraper this time. I'm just taking tiny little cuts from the inside out to create the concave rings. This is one of the tools that I originally purchased with my lathe. It's not a high quality tool at all, but it does the job. Might need sharpening a bit more than other tools, but I don't use it that much, so it's not worthwhile purchasing a really good one. So just working my way from the center outwards, you do have to be very careful as to not get a catch. The high points of the rings can chip a little bit depending what timber you're using. The outside of this piece also has like a concave The outer edge of this piece, like the previous one, does have a concave profile. So it sits on the two outside edges, has the gap in the middle where in that way it'll stand up on its own on the two outside edges and not fall over. Once I've done my first pass from the inside out, I'll go over it again and just clean it up with some smaller, lighter cuts. I'm also making sure that the rings are equal sizes as best I can. As I said, I don't measure, I sort of just do it by eye, and it generally turns out pretty good. The very outside edge and the very inside edge I'm leaving flat. This way, later on, I can sand off the high points to add a bit of contrast to the piece. I'm just using a little bit of sandpaper to clean it up. The round nose scraper did a pretty good job at making it nice and smooth, but a little sandpaper doesn't hurt. Of course, we're going to fill the rings with texture. It's not that important to sand it super well. It's probably more important up near the top of the rings where there might be a gap where the wood meets the texture, well, where I can't texture high enough. So here I am starting the texture on the outside rim using a larger burr in a die grinder. I usually texture the inside and the outside of each ring first and then fill in the middle. I'm always careful to try and keep it as tight as possible and not to go too far up the edge of the ring, otherwise it'll make a dent in the top and it'll look funny. I think this piece took me around about 2 hours to finish the texturing. I usually take lots of breaks. Taking lots of breaks keeps you fresh and it helps you not to make too many mistakes. I'm going to use the round carbide burr again, but in a different way. This time I'll be using it to create lines from the center to the outside. This is probably one of the harder textures you can do. It's very easy to mess up and it takes a lot of concentration to get them straight. As I said, it's very easy to mess up. As you're doing each stroke, if you start too high or end too high, you'll mess up the ring. If I haven't done this in a while, I'll take it very slowly, doing nice light strokes and taking my time with lots of breaks. You may not notice, but as I get through this texture on this particular ring, I actually speed up a little bit just from getting used to the movements and more confident in what I'm doing. It does leave a little bit of burr sometimes, as you can see the one I just did, but we can clean this up later, so don't feel the need to remove the burr as you go along. You also need to find the right size bit. A too smaller bit and a too bigger bit is actually harder. Just before I started the texturing, you'll notice that I used a ruler to create some lines. This creates sections and I work on one section at a time, and I'm always dividing, so in half, then in quarters, then in eighths, and then just fill in the remaining pieces. As an alternative to this round carbide bit, you could use a round burr bit instead. this would be a little bit trickier and create some weird lines, but you can go over it again just by touching it lightly to create a texture within the texture. You'll see this in one of the upcoming pieces in this video. A good alternative to using a round carbide bit is to use a ball-nosed carbide bit. This creates a texture that's not quite round, and I think it looks a lot better in some circumstances. Give it a try, let me know what you think. For this ring, I'm going to use a conical shaped carbide bit. Once again, it's one out of the set I bought many years ago. I'm going to create the texture long ways. You can also do it short ways, but in this case it wouldn't work as well because of the shape of the rings or the concave in the rings. Using this conical carbide burr in this way, doing the texture in long ways around the piece, takes a very long time to do. One thing I haven't mentioned so far is how I get rid of the burrs. As you're texturing it, can lift the fibers on the outside of each of the textures, and the way you can get rid of these is firstly perhaps with something like an eraser or a rubber, and the second way is you can just sort of use your finger or like a brush, and thirdly, the best way I've found so far is just using a piece of fine steel wool, and you just rub it in a circular motion or a cross motion or anti-clockwise rotation, and that should remove most of the burrs. Using sandpaper isn't a good idea because it dulls the edges, it flattens the edges, and your texture doesn't have enough depth then, and it just looks a bit not as good as using the steel wool. In this close-up you can see the little burrs on the edges of the texture, and in a moment I'll bring in the steel wool and clean it up. Once again, I've painted it off camera, although this time I didn't use the spray, I just used regular acrylic out of a tube, and this color is called Mars Black. It's kind of my favorite black there is, really. The rotary sander does a really good job at removing the paint off the piece. At the moment I'm just using a little bit of sandpaper folded in thirds, and then just taking my time to not take too much off the ridge points. Just little bits at a time so I don't go too far. This pink looking sandpaper I'm using at the moment is that ceramic coated sandpaper I mentioned before. It lasts a lot longer and it doesn't get clogged, and it has the fiber backing, so it's really strong. Once again, this is showing how I remove the tenon with a flap disc and a regular sander. It's just an example, but this is how I do it. And this is the final piece. So now I'm starting the second centerpiece, which you can use to attach the biggest pieces. And like before, this is how you create the spindle, as I said, which is about 40 millimeters long, and it's almost as large as the hole in the large piece, so it sits nicely in it. So what I'm using here to carve with is the Mini Sabur disc. I think it's about 15 millimeters in diameter. It's just like the big ones, but smaller. It's really good to use. It's really accurate. It's easy to make fine detail with it. And they last a very long time, just like the big ones. So like last time, I created the circle into segments, and I'm working on one segment at a time. So I create the two outer lines and then fill in the middle of the segment as I go. I will go around this a second time as well, just to clean things up and to make things a bit more symmetrical. I think at this point, where the texture or the carving meets the outer rim, it's not quite as thick as I wanted it to be, so I spent a bit of extra time just widening those outside sections. As you'll see, or as I progress through this piece, you'll notice that I actually start making them wider by default the first time, but still I'll go ahead and make some changes with the second or third pass just to tidy things up a bit. Take it easy, take your time, and take lots of breaks. It is mentally draining to concentrate so hard for so long. So as I said, it's always good to have breaks and refresh yourself every 10 to 20 minutes. Every 10 to 20 minutes seems about right for me. The beauty of carving with a tool like this, or the carbide burrs, is that it's much faster. This whole process probably would take around about 10-15 minutes or something like that, and that's from beginning to the very end. There's different grits you can get with these little burrs. I think there's medium, fine, and coarse. Each of them work really well, but I tend to just stick with the medium. There doesn't seem to be any need for me to go coarser or to go finer. The fine one will still leave little lines, and I kind of like the lines. I'll add some texture to this carving in a minute, and you'll see how it sort of works together to create a nice texture. As I said before, this mounting system, which you can put on your tool post or the workbench, does a really good job at helping out and making things a lot easier, because you can adjust the tilt or angle, and you can constantly move it around and it's locked in place. Nothing moves on its own, and so you can't make a mistake with the piece moving away from you while you're carving. It was a really good investment, and I like it a lot, and I can highly recommend this product. You can see here I wasn't initially happy with the overall depth, so I'm going over it again to make them a little bit deeper. If you make them too shallow, it just doesn't really pop on the outside, I suppose. I'm trying to line it up as best I can with the carving on the front. You don't have to get it perfect, because you can make fine adjustments to make it look correct or make it line up. This is probably a better angle to show you how you can line them up, and if you just take your time, you'll be fine. So can anyone guess what type of timber this is, and more importantly, where it originated? I'm using my small rotary tool to create lines using a very, very thin cut-off disc. The expensive ones that come with the tool, or the ones you can buy as an accessory, are expensive and they're thick. these are really, really thin. The downside to that is that because they're so thin, they can shatter so very easily, and sometimes you go through 2 or 3 in a piece. So always wear your safety glasses with these. I just picked these up from eBay, maybe a couple of dollars or $5 for about 20 to 30 of them. I actually find doing this type of texture with this tool is kind of fun and very satisfying. I don't know why, but once you get into a bit of a rhythm, it takes a while to do, but you get there and it's kind of enjoyable. Even though they're very thin, they still burn. I've done some pieces where I don't colour the piece afterwards or paint it, and it looks great. So you can combine this texture with some of the mini carbide burrs that I used earlier, and they look great together. From this angle you can see how the original carving created some little faint lines, and then we're putting these carved lines over the top, and then when we do the other direction you've basically got 3 types of lines creating one texture, so it gives it more depth because you're creating sort of 3 layers of texturing. Finally you get to see some painting. So this is just basically watered down acrylic paint. I don't have any particular ratio, I just sort of eyeball it, and if I put it on it turns out a bit thin, then I just add a bit more paint. In this case I painted 3 or 4 coats. The beauty of watering it down is that it is a thinner layer and it doesn't fill the texture up and clog it up, and basically then you don't have a texture. So you keep it thin, do more coats, and it should look great. If you only do a couple of coats, the colour of the wood shines through and gives a nice rustic look to it as well. So that's basically it. It's a nice quick little centerpiece. It's fun to make and it doesn't take too long. This is the third or the last large piece I'm going to make for this demo. It will be made of jacaranda and textured and eventually stained in a brown colour. Teak brown, I believe. Here you can see me starting to carve a couple of layers. This is the first way I was able to create a texture or 2 textures on a piece that butted right up against each other without any sort of lines. So the centerpiece in this case is higher than the outside piece. The outside piece is slightly concaved inwards, which allows the centerpiece to be higher but not make the piece wider. Drilling holes again. I'm having to hold it with my hand because my chuck sucks, so make sure you buy a good chuck, which I'm going to do shortly. This little carving tool is the Manpar Mini Carver. It has a little triangular head and it carves beautifully. I did sell these on my website for a time and I did sell lots of them. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to sell them anymore. You can actually get them in 3 profiles. There's the round profile and then the triangle, as you see here, and then finally there's a square profile. I generally use all of them all the time. The triangle and the square are probably my favorite. The square is something that I need to explore more because although at first I thought it was kind of boring, actually I think it's going to be really good once I get some time to experiment with some different textures. This one can also be a tricky one to do, as it's very easy to go higher up on the bevel, as you just saw there. Luckily though, on this kind of piece it doesn't really matter too much, so if you bump it a couple of times it's not going to ruin the piece. This texture is one of my favorite textures. It takes the longest to do, it takes the most amount of concentration, but the overall effect I think looks really good. Sort of like a material or linen kind of look, I think. The bit I'm using here to create the texture is a round Sabur ball. These balls are awesome because you can create a large amount of textures with them. You can drag them or you can dot them, but in this case I'm doing a combination of the both. So I'm dragging a line or curved lines, and then when I'm finished doing those I dot them with the ball without dragging, and that creates a texture within those curved lines. After that's completed I go over it again, just dotting it from another 2 different angles, which creates that kind of linen look within the lines. It takes a bit of planning to get this right. You sort of got to work your way from the inside out. Often you can get a little bit stuck and it might take you a couple of minutes to work out which way the line should go, so you don't, shoot yourself in the foot and mess it up a little bit. I haven't mentioned this yet, but maybe I should have earlier, is that when I'm texturing I always have a point of contact or a secondary point of contact while I'm texturing. So the ball will be touching the wood, but I'll be also resting my wrist on the wood behind it or something solid, and then I tilt the bit onto the wood to create the texture. I'm not actually texturing from above and just hovering in the air. I've actually got contact with the piece itself. Those earlier textures I did where I'm basically just dotting the bit onto the wood, it's more of like a seesaw effect. So you're seesawing forward, then moving a little bit, then seesawing forward, while keeping constant contact with the wood. I hope that makes sense. Anyway. This does burn the wood while you're doing it as well, and I think it looks fantastic in this texture. Unfortunately though, I've decided I'm just going to stain this piece because I want a bit of contrast to the center piece I'm going to attach it to. This texture actually takes a very, very long time to do. It takes a lot of energy because there's a lot of concentration. I go over it a bunch of times and I revisit places that I've textured earlier because I usually fix up where the lines end, or I might change which way the texture within the lines faces. But yeah, eventually you get there and you have nothing else you need to fix, and you're all done. The size of the ball bit also makes a big difference to how easy this texture's. Too small and it doesn't quite work, and too large and it doesn't work. I can't remember the size of this particular ball bit, but I'll look it up for when the demo actually airs, so I'll have it ready for you there. A lot of people ask me which mini rotary tool to buy, and I think basically they all pretty much suck. So I usually just recommend that people buy the cheapest one. This one is this cheaper version of a larger model they make, and it works just as well as a larger one, and is probably 1/3 of the cost of the larger one. For this type of texturing, you don't need a lot of power, so the cheaper one is perfectly fine. And the cheaper one is lighter too, and easier to use, and makes less noise, and just seems to be better. Here I am using my skew chisel again to create a line, and then using more of the flat part of the chisel to create a bit of a bevel that goes into the hole. Gives it a bit more of a finished or a classier finish. The stain I'm using here is the Feast Watson Proof Tint. It is an alcohol-based stain, so you can't mess it up. Some other stains actually sit on top of the wood and give a horrible streaky look, whereas this actually seeps into the wood and then the alcohol flashes off to give you a nice, smooth, perfect finish every time. Just be careful to remove every single little tiny scratch or mark, otherwise it will show. So this is actually the end of my demo, but because it's a little bit short, I'll play some texturing videos for you to have a look at. If you have any questions on how I made these pieces or any questions on these upcoming texturing videos, just let me know. Once again, enjoy! These concave eye cutters are really cool. They come in a variety of sizes and you can create all sorts of different patterns. I haven't explored these a great deal, but I plan to in the future. It seems like with a bit of imagination you can do a whole heap of different types of texturing or patterning on timber. This, perhaps combined with some of the other tools I have, could create some very new and unique looking pieces. Here I'm showing how you don't have to use them in the traditional way, which is of course straight down, and as it's designed to do, create an eye. You can lay them on its side or on a different angle or a slight angle to create different types of textures. The harder you press, the deeper they go. They are designed to burn the wood, which I think looks pretty cool. They do give different looks on different timbers, so experiment with different timbers and different textures to see what works for you the best. I'm not actually sure of the longevity of these bits, but I do know that they can do a large variety of things, as you can see. The effect looks great, but they're not super cheap. I think it's about $80 to $100 for a set of these. But I recommend them. I think with a bit of imagination you can create some pretty cool things. Here I am again using them in a non-traditional way to create ziggy lines. This is the Manpar Mini Carver, and I'm using the square profile. Earlier in the video you saw me using the triangle profile. This is my first attempt at creating textures with it, and I'm just trying out different angles and orientations to hold it to see what I can create. These mini cutters are tiny, smaller than what you think. They're really high quality and the tips are replaceable, so I can highly recommend these as well. Of course, different types of woods work better than other types of woods. Just experiment yourself to see which works best. But as you can see here, cutting across the grain seems to work best for me, particularly when you're using those small carbide burrs or even the larger ones. If you cut with the grain as opposed to across the grain, it creates a fuzzy edge at the beginning and the end, which is harder to remove and doesn't look real good. You don't always have to create textures, sometimes you can just create patterns, and that's what I'm having a go at here. You could also add textures to this pattern once you're completed using different tools to really make it sort of something, or really to make something different. The wood I'm using here is actually a really cheap, fast growing tree that they use in construction, usually to create door trims and window trims or architraves. It's very soft, very low quality, so you'll find that if you use a better timber, it'll look a lot better as well. I just use this to create sample boards which I hang up in my shop, and I can refer to them later on if I'm looking for an idea or can't remember quite how I created the texture in the first place. You can see here it's looking horrible, but it gives you an idea of what sort of textures you can still create. You could, I suppose, have a go at sharpening them, but the profiles can usually be rotated to give you a new edge. I haven't had to sharpen them yet, I've just been turning them around to get that new edge. Using the square cutter on a bit of an angle like this sort of almost gives the effect that the triangle cutter does, so it could be, I suppose, a two-in-one kind of tool. This is just a piece of scrap plywood again, so once again not particularly high quality timber. The really good thing about filling up your art with these kind of textures and covering completely is that there's no sanding. So this is the end of my first demo for 2023. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. And as I've said a couple of times before, if you have any questions, just let me know, and I'm happy to help. Get creative, have fun, and I'd love to see what you guys make. Just send them through on Instagram or Facebook, and yeah, it'd be very interesting to see what you guys can make out of all this information. Thank you.